Welcome to Dicejunkies. This is Blood X, and I'm joined today with Hugh, and we have a very special guest today, Mr. Alan Dean Foster. Um, uh, Alan Dean Foster has written over 138 fiction and novels, plus also some nonfiction and fiction short works. Um, the reason we reached out to you is because of your work on the series for Star Wars, Star Trek, the Alien franchise. So you definitely qualify for our geek culture niche, which is kind of what we're known for. So thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate your time, Mr. Foster.
Pleasure to be here, guys.
All right, so I want to start it off with one of the novels that you may actually get asked a lot of questions about, which is the Splinter of the Mind's Eye. And it's considered to be the very first entry into the Star Wars expanded universe. How much does it mean to you to kind of blaze a trail for other authors to follow you into the Star Wars expanded universe?
Of course, when the book was written, nobody was thinking about blazing any trails. The idea with Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the concept behind it, was that George, when he was thinking ahead, wanted to have more material available for people on the assumption that the film Star Wars would be successful. That included such things as comics, spin off toys, and such, and he wanted a book. Also, there was the thought that the book could be made into a low budget film if Star Wars was neither an enormous success nor a huge failure, so that you could adapt the book uh, cheaply, utilizing as many of the props and costumes and such from the first film as you possibly could. That was an instruction that was given to me by George. He said, the only thing I want you to keep in mind when you write the book is that it should be something that could be filmed on a low budget. So that's why I set Splinter on a fog-shrouded planet. Remember, no CGI back in those days.
Right.
And a lot of it also takes place underground. These are places where your backgrounds are fairly easy to set up in a studio and not expensive to film. So it was an interesting way to approach a novel from the very beginning. But as far as blazing a trail, nobody knew what would come after. Nobody even knew if there'd be a second film. It's easy to think about these things in retrospect, but at the time, nobody said, "Well, we're going to blaze a trail here by having this first sequel book come out, and then there'll be 500 sequel books to follow." Nobody had a thought in the world about that.
Right, and what's I found was interesting is that a lot of the content in the book, it appears that you actually had picked from old treatments of Star Wars: A New Hope that weren't used in the film. And I love the fact that this is the first time we're actually introduced to kyber crystals, which was in your book. Did George give you the information about the kyber crystals used for lightsabers in the Force, or did you come up with that on your own?
To be perfectly honest with you, there were a lot of discussions at the time, and I don't remember whether it was myself or George who came up with that. I'm going to say lightly that it was myself, because there was no mention of anything called a kyber crystal in the Star Wars screenplay that I worked from, and nobody said anything to me about it. But we needed kind of a MacGuffin, for those of you familiar with film lore, in the story, and kind of popped up with the kyber crystal. The reason I spelled it that way, because it's spelled differently now, I believe, is I didn't want anybody to confuse it with the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan.
Okay.
So that's why the alternate spelling. But I thought it would be a fun thing to play with. I thought the idea of having something that could magnify the force would be a useful thing to play around with, and that's where the kyber crystal came into the story.
So I have you to thank for that. I love the kyber crystals concept. Being a old D&D and fantasy fan, I came into knowledge of kyber crystals on Kotar, a Knights of the Republic game where you built your own lightsaber, and I fell in love with the concept of kyber crystals. So awesome. That was easily one of my favorite items. I hunted down the rare orange kyber crystal because it made it look like my lightsaber was a piece of the sun. And like I lived to get that orange kyber crystal. The kind of orange yellow kyber crystal color was beautiful. Looked like a setting sun.
I think my favorite was the silver one. That one was always fun to get as well.
True.
So I do have a question, and we've been talking for a while now, even before the recording, and I'm very curious about your answer to this question, which I've discussed with Mark and Q on the show in the past. But as an author, you've written both fantasy and science fiction books, and I'm curious to see how you can answer one of these debates that we have: is Star Wars science fiction or is Star Wars science fantasy, in your opinion?
That's a fairly easy one for me. Star Wars is science fantasy
Okay.
because we'd like it to be science fiction. But in science fiction, you have to have at least a certain percentage of science.
Right.
And there's very little science in Star Wars, deliberately so. Remember, George originally wanted to make Flash Gordon, a new Flash Gordon. There's very little science in Flash Gordon. And what you do is you have all the trappings and appearances of science fiction without the science. And that's not even taking into account something like the Force. I'm talking about the hardware and the astronomical aspects, and the fact that, people have been over and over this for decades. The fact that you have ships banking in space, like World War II fighters, when there's nothing to bank against,
Right.
and on and on and on and on. So what you have is it looks like science fiction, but it's really fantasy. So call it science fantasy.
I think me and Q agree with you on that one, and it's interesting how other people that I've talked to in the past, no, it's science fiction. I'm like, okay, where's the science aspects to back up your claim? Star Trek is sci-fi. It has a lot of science involved with it, a lot of theories, and even we have a lot of inventions today based on Gene Roddenberry's designs back in the '60s. But I do want to thank Mr. Foster for joining us today on Dicejunkies. You can definitely check him out on his website, his Facebook page. And Mr. Foster, again, thank you very much for your time. You have been a pleasure to talk to, and absolutely love geeking out with your stories.
Pleasure.